Hello everyone, I'm Miranda and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm really excited to be sharing my Brontë book collection with you. I'm having a bit of a Brontë inspired week at the moment because my mum and I recently went to the Brontë parsonage at Haworth, which was an incredible trip that I can't wait to share with you soon. But going and seeing where the Brontë sisters lived really inspired me to pull out my many books about the Brontë sisters, by the Brontë sisters, inspired by the Brontë sisters, and I wanted to share my collection with you all. So I've got a few piles of books to share, as always. I thought I'd share with you some of my favourite editions of the books by Anne, Charlotte and Emily. And then I also have a collection of biographies and books about the Brontes and their more extended family as well. And then I also have a collection of books about place and the Brontes, both where they lived in Yorkshire and also the houses and landscapes of their literature as well. And then I also have some books that are great fiction reads that are in some way inspired by the Brontes, either by the lives of the sisters or by the books that they wrote. So I've got a lovely lot of recommendations for all you Brontë fans today, and I hope you'll enjoy them. Let's get started. So first of all, I'm going to share some of my favourite editions of their books with you. First up, I have to show this gorgeous collection of poetry by Anne, Charlotte and Emily Brontë. I always find it fascinating to read the Brontë poetry as well as their literature, and I love this collection of poems that was published by Crown Classics. I think it's just a really gorgeous cover. You can see that. And it's a lovely edition. They've done quite a few poetry books in this series, and I have a few of them, mainly of female poets, and I love that they've done this little collection of the Brontë sisters' poetry. It's not a complete collection, it's selected poems, but there are some real gems in here, so I'm so pleased to have such a nice edition of some of their most loved poetry. And then if you're on Instagram, then this book will probably look familiar to you. This is a beautiful edition of Wuthering Heights by Chiltern Classics. As always, I'll link all of these books in the description box down below, by the way, so you can check them out. I love getting beautiful editions of my favourite books, so I do love to collect some especially gorgeous editions of the classics. And I couldn't resist this cover. I collect different editions for different reasons. I will always want editions of classic works of literature that have a good introduction, that have good footnotes and things like that. This isn't what you get in a book like this. This is really judging a book by its cover a bit, because I do love the design on this. I love to photograph these Chiltern Classic books. They just look so beautiful, they're so eye-catching. So I collect sort of both editions of classics that have all of the interesting introductions and things like that, but also I do like to get some very beautiful editions too. So the Chiltern Classics have done lovely ones of both Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre by the Brontë sisters, and Wuthering Heights is the most gorgeous cover, I think. I just love that one. So that's a sort of special one in my collection. A problem with some of the prettier editions that you can get of the classics is that they tend to do the most famous ones. So there are so many gorgeous editions of Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre, but there aren't so many of the other books. However, I do like this series, and I can't remember what the publisher is called. Arcturus. So Arcturus have done these little, almost pocket-sized editions of all of the books by the Brontes. I love Anne Bronte. It always saddens me when her work gets a little bit neglected. So it was really nice for me to be able to get a nice hardback edition of Agnes Grey, which is quite hard to find. And I have their whole little set of all of the Bronte novels, which I really like, and they're all in sort of pretty different colours. Again, these aren't the books to get if you want a good academic introduction and things like that, but they are lovely if you just want an attractive set of all of the books on your shelves, so I recommend these. Speaking of good introductions and so on, I really love to get the Penguin English Library editions. I like both the paperbacks as a good sort of reading copy, and I have all of the Bronte books in the paperbacks and also in the hardbacks. These are wonderful because not only are they beautiful, but they also have good notes on the text, good introductions. When I'm reading the book myself, I really want a volume with all of the extra notes and things like that. So these tend to be the ones I really read, and I like to read the paperbacks as a good sort of reading copy. So these are beautiful editions because I love the covers by Coralie Bickford Smith. The cover designs are actually very, very attractive on these, and they look so gorgeous on the shelf. So these are sort of the best of both worlds, I think. I really love these editions. But there are some absolutely gorgeous ones that I cannot resist getting. I have recently shown you this stunning edition of Jane Eyre, and it's illustrated by Marjolaine Baston, and it's absolutely glorious. It's got all of these little extras in it too that go all through the book. They're sort of interspersed amongst the pages, and this is you can see Jane's advertisement in the newspaper that she's put in wanting a sort of post as a governess, and I think it's just really fun how she's done little things like that inspire you as you go through the book. But there are also just gorgeous illustrations. Ooh, all these special things falling out, but it's just beautifully illustrated, and I would like to read this one just for the pleasure of stumbling across all the little extras included and the little illustrations throughout, all sorts of different flowers and things at the start of each chapter. It's really stunning. It's a big book, it's a heavy one, not the sort of thing you'd take on the train with you or anything like that. But if you're a fan of Jane Eyre, then what a stunning edition to get. I mean, I just love it. And I think there's going to be an edition of Wuthering Heights in this same series coming out in the autumn. So I'm excited for that too. But then I also love as real sort of special editions again. And I think these are books, it's fair to say, will become quite collectible too in years to come. These are I always forget the publisher name of this one. Oh yes, it's Thomas Nelson, and it's the Seasons editions with the beautiful paper cut covers. This is covered in plastic to protect the cover because it's really quite fragile. You don't want the cutaway paper catching on something and tearing, but you can remove the plastic, which I do when I'm photographing the book, for instance. There are some illustrations throughout as well with quotes from the text, which I really like. And these are sort of limited editions, and I think they've done about 10,000 of each. And they're just very, very beautiful. So this one is Wuthering Heights, and then this is Jane Eyre, which I think is stunning. The different seasons have different coloured covers. This is light blue with a sort of burgundy base, and then this one is white with the navy And Jane Eyre, they also come with like lovely bookmarks like this. I think that's really pretty. It's so delicate, but really lovely. And they're just very beautiful editions, and they look amazing on the shelf. So yes, these are real sort of collector's editions as well, but I absolutely love them. But yes, so those are my editions of the Brontë books that I love the most, and I thought you would be interested in seeing them as well. And then let's move on to the sort of biographies and things like that I have about the Brontes. So one of the most famous ones is Elizabeth Gaskell's Life of Charlotte Brontë. I think I first read this as a teenager, and I'd really like to read it again. I mean, you can't take everything, you know, as gospel that's said in this. Elizabeth Gaskell was a friend of Charlotte Bronte's. She very much portrayed Charlotte's life in a way that she perceived it herself and also wanted others to perceive it. But it's so interesting to read this, not only as a look at Charlotte Brontë through the eyes as a friend, but also Elizabeth Gaskell was a writer in her own right. So this is just a really good piece of literature for its own sake as well. And I think it's also meant to be the first biography of a female author written by another female author, which is rather wonderful too. That if not the first, it is at least a very early example of that. So this is quite a special biography for that reason as well. Now this is a biography I haven't read yet, because you can see how massive it is, and I actually just bought this when we moved to Yorkshire, and I do want to read it, but I need to set aside some serious reading time to get through this, and it has to be a period when I don't have too many other reading commitments, so I'm not quite sure when that will be, but I do definitely want to read this, and that's The Brontes by Juliet Barker. And this is really meant to be the sort of definitive biography of the Brontes. There's so much information in this about the family, and I really can't wait to read it. I know it will be absolutely fascinating, but it will have to be maybe in the sort of cold winter evenings sometime. That would be quite a good one to get through. At the sort of other end of the spectrum, in terms of thickness of book, this is quite a nice one. It's the Bronts Treasury, The Lifetimes and Works of Charlotte, Emily and Anne by Jane O'Neill. I love the cover on this too, if you can see that. And this is nice because it's just a very accessible, slim, easy to read introduction both to the Bronte sisters and their life in Yorkshire and Haworth, but there are also some interesting essays on their books as well. So it's a really nice overview of their work and their life and how those two things intersected a lot. So if you just want a brief overview, then I really do recommend this one. I adore reading Virginia Woolf on other writers, and she has a very famous essay on Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights in The Common Reader. And I can't remember, oh, it's just called Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights in here, the essay. But it's really well worth reading. I love reading critical literature myself. I used to have the Cambridge Companion to the Brontes, but I seem to have lost that, which is annoying. I think I'll have to buy it again because I really enjoyed that. But like I said, I love Virginia Woolf's non-fiction writing anyway, and her thoughts on other great novels and writers, and her essay on those two Bronte books is very famous and well worth reading. I really recommend it. I've told you that Anne Bronte is probably my favourite actually of the Brontes. I adore The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. That's one of my favourite books. I mean, I really am very fond of Jane Eyre too. It's hard for me to choose between Jane Eyre and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall because I love them both very, very much. But sadly, I feel Anne Bronte has always been the most neglected of the Bronte sisters. And so I was really thrilled when this biography came out. It's called Take Courage, Anne Bronte and the Art of Life by Samantha Ellis. Samantha Ellis wrote a wonderful book called How to Be a Heroine. And this book is part memoir as well as part biography, and that it also traces Samantha Ellis's love of the Brontes generally and Anne Bronte in particular, and her life as she also read more about Anne's life. I really liked that mix. I really love Samantha Ellis as a writer. I think she's a great writer, and it was really interesting to also read her particular perspective on Anne Bronte. But she really did a very good job in fleshing out Anne Bronte a bit more. There's just not so much to work with, unlike with Charlotte, there's so many letters and of course all her writings and everything. With Anne there's a bit less to work with, but I thought that Samantha Ellis did a really great job, and it brought Anne more alive to me, which I so enjoyed. So if you're interested in reading more about Anne Bronte, then I very much recommend this. But it's a good book if you're just a fan of the Brontes generally, because it really is a fascinating read, and it's very, very readable too. Really easy to read, this one, really enjoyable. This is another great biography of Charlotte Bronte by Claire Harmon. I bought this years and years ago, and I want to read it again because I don't remember it very well. And now I'm living in Yorkshire and the Bronte Museum has opened up again. We've already been, and I'm planning to go back so many more times. It means that I want to know so much more about their lives. It's so special to see where they lived, and it makes me want to go back and read some of these biographies again, because now I can properly picture it. The rooms that they sat in and worked in and talked and slept and ate. It's so magical to have seen all of that with my own eyes, and I know that it will make even more sense to me when I go back and read the biographies now that I've seen it in the flesh. So I want to return to this one because I remember it was a very, very good biography of Charlotte, and I really recommend that. And then this is such a fantastic volume if you're a fan of the Brontes. It's the Oxford Companion to the Brontes by Christine Alexander and Margaret Smith. I'll show you the cover. And it's just so good. You can look up anything in here, from wide Sargasso Sea to feminist approaches to the literature, to Angria and Gondal, the sort of imagined kingdoms of the Brontes. You can just look up so much. There's so much fascinating information in here, and it's just so handy if there's a particular topic or theme or film, or I don't know, sort of anything like that that's Bronte related, you just want to find out a bit more about it, then you can look it up in this book. And it's been so well put together, so well researched. It's definitely a very, very handy companion to anyone who loves the Brontes. So I really recommend this. And then another part biography by Juliet Barker, who wrote this great big fat one, is this, The Brontes, A Life in Letters. And here she really examines their lives very much through the lens of looking in particular at the letters that they wrote, including Patrick Bronte as well, their father, and there are a lot of letters by Branwell, I think, in here too. And this is one I've enjoyed sort of picking up and flicking through. I haven't read it cover to cover, but it's something I've really enjoyed dipping in and out of, looking at their letters, and I would like to read it all properly as well, but it's really fascinating, so I really recommend this one too. Makes a great companion, I think, to if you do read a sort of cohesive biography, then it's also interesting to read this alongside, I think, which really dives deeper into their own voices through their letters. I think that's really interesting. And then another celebration of the Bronte letters is this beautiful book, which is the Illustrated Letters of the Brontes, the Letters, Diaries and Writings of Charlotte, Emily and Anne Bronte by Juliet Barker. I was recently sent this book by Batsford Publishing Company. I was so thrilled to get it because I have a lot of their books in this series of illustrated letters, and I was so thrilled that they've done one on the Brontes now, and it's really beautiful. Again, it's a nice little biography of their lives as well. It's a nice sort of compact read that has all sorts of fascinating illustrations with it, and extracts from their letters and diaries, which makes it all a lot more personal. So it's a really wonderful book. I really recommend this one too. I love the cover as well. It's absolutely stunning. And then I'm going to get my big pile. Well, I've got two more piles, some on looking at location, particularly in the books, and then some fiction inspired by the Brontes. So let me swap my piles around and I'll be right back. Okay, I've swapped my piles around. I'm filming in a little bit of a different location today. I'm in my bedroom and looking out my window just here. It's a beautiful summery day, and I thought it'd be fun to film here for a change. So I've got some books here, all about location, as it were. And this one is such an interesting book. It's called Novel Destinations, a travel guide to literary landmarks from Jane Austen's Bath to Ernest Hemingway's Key West by Shannon McKenna Schmidt and Joni Rendon. So you can see this isn't Bronte specific, but it's got a very good section about visiting the Bronte parsonage at Haworth. I'm not going to say too much about that yet because I have a whole video coming about my visit to the parsonage, but if you're looking to visit it too, then there's a really good section in this book about the Bronte Parsonage Museum, and there's got a bit about their lives living there as well, and a few things on what to look out for in particular. They've got a little section called Don't Miss, so it's things like the black sofa on which Emily took her dying breath, which we did see. It was so moving, it really was. And a few other things that they tell you sort of not to miss at the parsonage itself. And then they have a few suggestions as to where to go to sort of have a drink or where to stay, and other places in the area that you might want to explore. So I love this book. It's a really fun read, but there is also a nice section on the Brontes in here, so I wanted to point that out. And then this book is another great read, House of Fiction by Phyllis Richardson. From Pemberley to Brideshead, Great British Houses in Literature and Life. And in this book there is a section on, it's chapter 5, and it's called Mad Woman in the Attic, Author in the Dining Room, The Haunts of Charlotte Bronte. And this is interesting because it looks not only at the sort of fictional house in Jane Eyre, but it also looks at some of the homes that inspired Charlotte Bronte, and also where she lived herself at Haworth, at the parsonage. So it's a really interesting essay in this one. I really recommend it. And then there's a similar book called Novel Houses, 20 famous fictional dwellings, and this book really focuses on fictional houses in literature, and this chapter is particularly on Wuthering Heights and Emily Bronte. It's a plague on both your houses, and it really examines the importance of home and of losing home in Wuthering Heights, and it's a very interesting essay in this book on that topic, and I really recommend this one as well. And then in a sort of similar vein, I think this book is sadly out of print now, which is a shame, but I'll still write the title below, and it's More Literary Houses by Rosalind Ashe. This one is very interesting because it doesn't look at the very obvious choice of Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre. It has a look at Wide Sargasso Sea and the estate in that book. Wide Sargasso Sea was of course very much inspired by Jane Eyre, and it tells the story of the first Mrs Rochester, who came from Jamaica. And this looks at the old family estate there, and the author has sort of imagined what this house would have looked like. She's drawn a map of it, which is really interesting. And what she always does, and there she's found a sort of painting of what could be the house. And what she does in this is she either takes a character from the book that she's writing about, or she sort of invents a character. And for this take on Wide Sargasso Sea, she's invented a character who has met Christophine, I think that's her name, Christophine Dubois, who knows the first Mrs Rochester. And this character describes meeting this woman and learning about Mr Rochester and his new wife, and he sort of writes home to his sister about this meeting. So it's a great work of imagination and an exploration of the text. It also brings Wide Sargasso Sea sort of to life a bit more by showing you what the rooms might have looked like, what the house might have looked like, what some of the objects described, like this chest in the book, what they might have looked like. So really, really interesting, and definitely a book I recommend if you can track down a copy. And then this is very much Bronte specific, and I just got this book around Christmas time in one of our local bookshops. It's Bronte Places and Poems by J.R. Taylor and C.E. Taylor, a pictorial guide to the settings and landscapes that inspired their writing. And this is a fantastic guide, especially if you're in Yorkshire, because so many of the locations are in Yorkshire, and it really looks at where the Bronte sisters went, what places inspired their writing, and just what they would have seen, where they explored. And there are loads and loads of photos, which is fabulous. So I know I'm going to be using this book a lot as I explore more Bronte territory over the summer. And yeah, it's just such a great book if you're interested in the landscapes of the Brontes, and I think this is a brilliant read. But anyway, now let's move on to some fiction that I have that I recommend and that's inspired by the Brontes, either by their lives or by some of their most famous books. So I've already mentioned Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. This is of course inspired by Jane Eyre. It can also be read as a fascinating book in its own right, but Jean Rhys herself grew up partly in Dominica, and when she read Jane Eyre, she became completely fixated on how the first Mrs Rochester, the mad woman in the attic, is portrayed in the book. And she wanted to give this marginalised voice a story of her own. And she really puzzled as how to portray this woman's life and how to tell this story. And in the end, she wrote it. It's very slim. It's really only novella length. And it's written in a series of 3 monologues. The first and the last are told through Antoinette's, well, Bertha or Antoinette, her story, and then the middle one is told from Mr Rochester's perspective. And it's very, very interesting. It's so vividly described, and I think it is a really good book to read alongside Jane Eyre as well. It really looks at the history of colonialism that was part of the context, and it's just a very thought-provoking book that is a great companion read to Jane Eyre. So definitely one to add to your pile if you haven't read it yet. And then going back to Yorkshire, this is a great Yorkshire book that's definitely has a few nods to Jane Eyre, and that's South Riding by Winifred Holtby. And this is about a young woman who returns to her native Yorkshire village to become a teacher. And there she meets a man. I think she first meets him as he's on a horse or something. I don't, it's very Jane Eyre meeting sort of Mr Rochester style, I think. And he ends up having some secrets and a past, very like Mr Rochester's. And he has a young daughter who also attends the school. So there are some very strong influences from Jane Eyre in this book. It's very much a story in its own right too, and I really recommend it. It's such a good read, such a good Yorkshire story again. There was also a really good TV series that came out 7 or 8 years ago, and I really recommend watching that too if you haven't seen that yet, because it was very good. But yes, a really good read as well. And then this book, Peter's Room by Antonia Forrest, is such an interesting children's book. It's in the series about the Marlowe family by Antonia Forrest, and that was a real mixture of both school stories about a girls' boarding school where the Marlowe sisters go to school, but she also wrote a lot of holiday books within that series, and this is one of the holiday ones where the family are home for the Christmas holidays on their farm, and the weather is terrible and bitterly cold. They're bored, and one of the sisters, Ginty, starts to talk about a school project she's been given to find out more about the Bronte sisters and their brother Branwell. And in particular, she learns about the fantasy worlds that the Bronte siblings created for each other and told stories about and sort of lived in for much of their childhood and even well into adulthood, especially in the case of Emily, for instance. And those were the kingdoms that the Brontes created, of Gondal and Angria, I think is the other one. And the children, the Marlowe children in Peter's Room, become inspired by this idea, and they decide to invent their own fantasy lands where they can play act storylines. And it's such an interesting book. It's the only sort of children's book I can think of where a good sort of section of it is taken up with a discussion between some of the sisters about the Brontes, about how bizarre it was that they lived so much in this fantasy world, why they chose to do that, what some of the dangers of giving in too much to your imagination are, how it might have affected Emily and her writing, would she have written more if she hadn't been so taken up with these fantasies? There's a really interesting discussion about the Brontes and about the dangers of giving in too much to your imagination and living in a fantasy land in this book. And some of those dangers come up for the children as they get more and more drawn into this fantasy world that they've created. But it's also shown as an important way that they can act out emotions or ideas that they maybe don't know how to articulate in real life. And their imaginings help them to explore some of these grey areas in relationships and in life that young teenagers come up against and try hard to process. But it also tips into a bit of danger when things go a bit too far in the fantasy. It's a really thought-provoking, excellent read, and I highly recommend it. It's sadly out of print. This is an Old Girls Gone By edition, but if you can track down a second-hand copy, then I really recommend it. And you can read it as a standalone too. You don't have to have read the other books in the series to understand this one. And yeah, I really recommend it. Then following up from that, this is such an interesting read. The Brontes Went to Woolworths by Rachel Ferguson. Again, this really examines the dangers of too much imagination. It's about 3 sisters who live with their mother sort of post World War One. One of the sisters is a journalist, the other an aspiring actress, and then their youngest sister is still in the nursery with a governess. But how all of these sisters and their mother relieve the sort of tedium and disappointments of their everyday lives is, like the Brontes, they have a kind of fantasy world in which they all participate. Theirs is a bit different, and they haven't created imaginary lands and kingdoms, but they invent personalities, they pretend to know famous people, for instance, that they in fact don't know in real life, but in their imaginings they do, and they have whole conversations with these people, phone calls and interactions. They pretend to be sent Christmas presents from others. It's a real line between downright creepy and sort of, British bohemian eccentricity going on here. One of the sisters, who primarily tells the story, Deirdre, becomes so fixated on well-known people vaguely within her circle, for instance, that she will track down photographs of them. She stalks them, essentially walks by their houses, starts to know their timetables and everything. And she starts to do this with an elderly judge whose cases she goes and watches in the London courts. And then events conspire that she in fact ends up knowing this person in real life too, but the whole family has pretended they've known this judge for the past 2 years in their fantasy land. But then reality and fantasy collide, and it's a at times very funny account of how Deirdre and her family learn to negotiate the sort of new reality for themselves. I have to say, it's a very odd book. It is not one of my favourites. The Brontes do make an appearance in this too. Their ghosts come back and sort of visit with the sisters in this book in a very, very bizarre twist. So I would say that this is a very strange read. If you like very quirky reads, then you probably would enjoy this. Again, it's an interesting look at where imagination and fantasy can go too far and some of the perils of that. But it's not one of my favourite books. I will say that. It was a bit too odd for me, just a bit too eccentric. The opening is very good though. There's a very good quote. Unfortunately, I found it a bit all downhill from here. But one of the opening paragraphs is, "A woman at one of my mother's parties once said to me, 'Do you like reading?' which smote us all to silence. For how could one tell her that books are like having a bath or sleeping or eating bread, absolute necessities which one never thinks of in terms of appreciation?" And we all sat waiting for her to say that she had so little time for reading before ruling her right out forever and ever. I really did like that line from the book, but that was my favourite part of it, to be honest. But it still is an interesting one to look at in terms of the Brontes and this specific idea of living in a fantasy. Then quite a fun short story is Tea with Mr Rochester, which is in this short story collection that's called Tea with Mr Rochester by Frances Towers. Again, this is about a young girl who starts to weave a bit of a Jane Eyre, Mr Rochester fantasy around a man that her aunt knows. And again, when fantasy and reality collide at a tea party, it leads to a very embarrassing incident. But it's definitely quite a fun short story to read, particularly if you're a fan of Jane Eyre. And this whole collection of short stories are really very strong. This is one of the Persephone books, as you can tell by the grey cover. And if you enjoy short stories, I would recommend that one. Then this is a really fun book, especially for those who are maybe familiar with Haworth or who want to go to Haworth. It's called Miss Hogg and the Bronte Murders by Austen Leigh. This has been republished by Grey Ladies. And I read this a few months ago now and really enjoyed it. Miss Hogg is a retired school mistress who's become a lady detective, solving crimes with the help of her friend, and it's just quite a fun one. The mystery isn't the strongest, I have to say. By the end I was so confused by all the different characters, and like the motive, if I remember, is really quite weak, but it still is quite a fun literary sort of mystery. Someone gets murdered in Haworth, and he has this locked suitcase, and he was trying to find a sort of old manuscript of Emily Bronte's that had supposedly just been discovered, and then the setting moves to Oxford, and I think also Stratford-upon-Avon is one of the settings in here too. So lots of different literary settings, but it starts in Haworth, and there's a sort of Bronte connection to this mystery that is fun. So yeah, just quite a fun read, and I liked the descriptions of Haworth in here especially too. And then these two collections of short stories are great for the Bronte fan. I Am Heathcliff is a collection curated by Kate Moss, and it's a collection of all different short stories written by different authors about stories inspired by Wuthering Heights. So this is an interesting take on sort of looking at Wuthering Heights through many different perspectives. And lots of different writers are in here: Anna James, Louisa Young, Erin Kenny, Joanna Cannon, Laurie Penny, Sophie Hannah. So this is quite a fun short story collection. And then its sort of companion volume is this one, Reader, I Married Him, Stories Inspired by Jane Eyre by Tracy Chevalier. And again, there are some great modern writers who have written stories in response to Jane Eyre in some way. There's Tessa Hadley, Emma Donoghue, Susan Hill, Elif Shafak, Evie Wilde, Sally Vickers, Nadifa Mohammed, Tracy Chevalier herself, of course, but some really great writers in here, and another really fascinating collection of short stories. And then two other mysteries, these very much inspired by the Bronte sisters, and that's The Vanished Bride and The Diabolical Bones by Bella Ellis. Bella Ellis is a pseudonym inspired by Emily Bronte's pseudonym. I can't remember the real name of the author. Rowan Coleman. So she's written a few other books under her real name, but then she's just started this series of mysteries called the Bronte Mysteries, where she takes the real life Bronte sisters and has them solving all of these crimes that pop up around Haworth. They're really quite enjoyable. There's The Vanished Bride, and then the second one is The Diabolical Bones. Sometimes I feel they're written a bit too much from the sort of modern perspective, and it can be a bit heavy-handed. The sort of more modern feminism, for instance, that's kind of injected into the Bronte sisters in these books. It doesn't always read as smoothly as you might like, but I still find them just sort of fun reads, especially from a modern perspective. And then a modern romance inspired by the Brontes is The Anglophile's Notebook by Sunday Taylor. And this is about an American woman whose marriage is ending, and she comes to the UK and has a sort of whirlwind romance, not only with a very attractive bookseller, but with England in general. And she has some wonderful literary excursions in this book, most notably to Yorkshire, and she becomes involved in a bit of a literary mystery surrounding the Bronte sisters, and it's really quite a fun, light read. There are some lovely descriptions of Haworth in this book, and yes, if you like the Brontes and a bit of romance, and if you're an Anglophile, then I do recommend The Anglophile's Notebook by Sunday Taylor. And then finally, this is a book that really looks at Branwell Bronte a bit more. There is, of course, a haul from my collection on the Brontes. Daphne du Maurier wrote a famous biography of Branwell Bronte, and I don't have a copy of it, which I realise I really need to get because I'm such a fan of Daphne du Maurier and I really want to read that. But this is a work of fiction, and it looks at Bronte's mistress, Branwell Bronte's mistress, and it's a novel by Finola Austen. Branwell Bronte famously had a very scandalous affair with Mrs Robinson, who was the mother of the young boy that he tutored at a sort of in a wealthy family nearby. And this book really looks at Mrs Robinson's perspective, both on Branwell Bronte and on Anne Bronte, who was a governess in her household at the time as well. And it's really interesting to hear her side of the story, and also to have a bit more of a focus on Branwell, as he is a Bronte that you don't tend to hear quite as much about, at least not as much as his famous sisters. So anyway, those are all of my books about the Brontes, inspired by the Brontes. You can see I've got quite a collection. I was surprised actually by how many books on them I have, but they're such a fascinating family. I think that's so much a part of the draw, isn't it? It's not just their fiction, but it's their lives, how they lived, that fascinates so many people. So I hope you've enjoyed my recommendations. Do give this video a thumbs up if you did, and you can subscribe to my channel by clicking on my face that pops up on the screen. But I'll see you again very soon. Goodbye.